Welcome to this new podcast from the Academy for Football Culture. My name is Marnix Beyen, and just as in my previous contribution, I would like to talk about a small country at this tournament. Once again, one whose qualification for the World Cup has sparked enormous emotions. Last time I spoke about Bosnia. Today it is Cape Verde, the country that held title contender Spain to a draw last week and is facing Uruguay today. Just as Bosnia's 1-1 draw against Canada led to scenes of celebration, Cape Verde's 0-0 draw also triggered great festivities. Seeing such emotions can reconcile me somewhat with a World Cup about which I have many serious reservations. Yet, that is not the reason why I want to devote today's contribution to Cape Verdean football culture. I do so as a historian with a strong interest in the history of colonization and decolonization. Together with my colleague Michael Luikvasseel, whom you have already heard speaking about the Congolese leopard, I teach a course to our third-year students on Belgian colonization and decolonization in Central Africa. In that course, we also address the question of how both descendants of colonizers and of the colonized can overcome the social and cultural legacy of colonialism. Cape Verdean football culture can teach us a great deal about precisely this issue, especially when compared with that of Congo. Let me begin with a memory from a trip I made with my family to the Cape Verde Islands in 2022. The Benfica Lisbon fan shop, or Casa Benfica, in the capital city of Praia, immediately aroused my historical curiosity. Isn't Benfica a Portuguese club, and wasn't Portugal the former colonizer that took possession of Cape Verde in the 15th century and granted it independence only in 1975? A colonizer that long used the islands as a transit point for enslaved people from West Africa, whom it subjected to great cruelty? Such a Casa Benfica would be somewhat comparable to finding an RSC Anderlecht fan shop in Kinshasa, which, to my knowledge, does not exist. My surprise increased further when I learned that the shop had been established only 4 years earlier, at a time when there were widespread international calls to have the political decolonization followed by profound mental and economic decolonization. It was, for example, a period in which anti-French sentiment was growing strongly in West Africa itself. There are, however, several reasons why the presence of a Benfica fan shop in Praia is less surprising than it may seem at first glance. First, it is a Benfica shop and not one belonging to city rival Sporting Lisbon. The latter club supported Antonio de Salazar's dictatorship during the decades following the Second World War and thus also the associated colonialism, just as Real Madrid supported Franco in Spain. Vincent Scheltins Ortigosa explained this earlier in this series. Benfica, by contrast, remained a club of, between brackets, ordinary people. It was not identified with Salazar's imperial project. The second part of the answer was provided by the large photograph displayed as the shop's signboard. It depicted Eusebio da Silva Ferreira, known simply as Eusebio, the legendary Mozambican footballer who scored 317 goals in 301 matches for the Lisbon club between 1961 and 1975, and who also played 64 times for the Portuguese national team during roughly the same period, scoring another 41 goals. The Casa Benfica was even founded on a square that had been named after Eusebio in 2009. At the time, Praia's mayor, Ulisses Correa Silva, described Eusebio as a symbol of Lusophony and of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries. Since 2016, Correa Silva has served as the Prime Minister of Cape Verde. The fan shop therefore honors not primarily a club from the former colonial metropolis, but rather one that plays an iconic role within the transcontinental Portuguese-speaking world, or, in other words, the global Lusophone community. Benfica shops can also be found in other Luso-African countries such as Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau and São Tomé. And supporter songs for the club can be heard throughout these countries. Listen just a moment to Samba Benfica, a song recorded by the Angolan singer Yuli da Cunha in 2010 to celebrate Benfica's championship title, referring to Samba, the Angolan predecessor of Samba. Admittedly, Lusophony was promoted by Salazar, and the dictator also used Eusebio to demonstrate how multicultural his empire supposedly was. Yet, the success of Lusophony is certainly not merely the creation of a right-wing dictator. Precisely because Portuguese colonization lasted longer than any other, this global Lusophone identity was able to develop more deeply than even La Francophonie, or arguably even the Anglophone culture of the British Commonwealth. Throughout this period, large-scale population movements occurred between different parts of the Portuguese Empire. From the 1950s onward, in particular, large numbers of Cape Verdeans migrated to Portugal, mainly for economic reasons. Such a development was unthinkable under the relatively short Belgian colonization of Central Africa. Belgian rule began only in the final quarter of the 19th century, at a time when European racism was more deeply rooted than ever. Fearing that Belgian society would be, between brackets, contaminated through contact with the supposedly uncivilized peoples of Central Africa, Belgian colonial authorities prohibited Congolese and later Rwandans and Burundians from traveling to Belgium until well into the 1950s. It was therefore inconceivable that Congolese footballers would play for the Belgian national team, as Eusebio did for Portugal. Leon Mokuna, who had been playing in the Belgian league since 1957, never progressed beyond the reserve squad. After Congolese independence, many Congolese footballers began playing in the Belgian league. In the early 1970s, however, they were recalled by Mobutu, who wanted his Léopard to put the independent state of Zaire, as he renamed Congo, on the international map. A Zairean league composed exclusively of Zairean players formed part of his policy of authenticité, through which he sought to rid the new nation of its entire colonial legacy. The rulers of post-colonial Cape Verde felt no need for such a policy of authenticity. Indeed, to some extent, this was even impossible. Returning to a pre-colonial tradition was not really an option, because before Portugal began using these volcanic islands in the 15th century as a base connected to the enslavement of West Africans, the islands had been uninhabited. Over the following 5 centuries, countless biological ties and cultural influences emerged between Portuguese settlers and the descendants of enslaved West Africans. As a result, the Portuguese legacy could never be entirely cast off. Monuments referring to Portuguese colonization, for example, still occupy prominent places in Praia. And what about Cape Verdean footballers? Not only did they continue to play in the Portuguese league, but some also represented the Portuguese national team after independence, just as one of them had already done in the 1950s. A Cape Verdean national team was not established until 1978 and first competed in a FIFA competition in 1982. A few years ago, I came into contact with one of the 8 Cape Verdean footballers who have played for Portugal. Antonio, known as Tony Paes, earned his sole cap for Portugal in 1983 against West Germany. Before that, he had also played for the Cape Verdean national team before it was recognized by FIFA. Tony has lived in Belgium for many years now and remains active as a football coach. His story reflects a strong sense of Cape Verdean pride, but also a lasting identification with Portugal, where he lived and worked for many years and where his children still reside. He only uses the word colonization when I ask him directly about it, and even then he speaks in very cautious terms. Let me quote him briefly in his own language, both because it allows him to express himself most subtly and because the Academy for Football Culture celebrates multilingualism.
Apesar de tudo, em Cabo Verde não se sentiu uma colonização muito forte. Claro que há sempre aqueles aspectos específicos e não só, que as pessoas acabam por sentir na pele, seja a nível de estudo, de escolaridade, de trabalho, função pública, professorado e demais profissões, e a discriminação normal que poderia existir e com muita solidariedade, mas Cabo Verde teve sorte de ser um país pequeno, onde era muito mais fácil as pessoas se organizarem e terem um confronto quase que face a face com as pessoas da potência colonial, mas que conseguiu desfazer isso e viver-se isso de uma forma muito subtil.
Let me translate. Despite everything, colonization in Cape Verde was not felt in a very strong way. Of course, there were always certain specific aspects that people ultimately experienced firsthand, whether in education, work, the civil service, teaching, or other professions. And there was the usual discrimination that could exist and that was sometimes deliberate. But we were fortunate that it was a small country where it was much easier for people to organize themselves and almost confront representatives of colonial power face to face. People managed to break through that and they experienced it in a very, very subtle way. For that reason, Tony certainly did not regard playing for the Portuguese national team as a betrayal of independent Cape Verde. In fact, the creation of a Cape Verdean national team increased opportunities for Cape Verdean players to play in Portuguese leagues and for the Portuguese national team. In turn, this helped improve the Cape Verdean national team itself. Probably, they ultimately benefited more from this interaction than the Congolese players whom Mobutu withdrew from Belgium. Today, the Cape Verdean national team is far less dependent on Portugal than it was in Tony Pailish's era. Lusophone connections remain very strong, but they have become part of much broader international networks. Like several other teams at this World Cup, including Bosnia's, the Cape Verdean squad consists to a large extent of diaspora players. Of the 14 players born outside Cape Verde, however, only 3 were born in Portugal. The others were mostly born in other European countries, with a particularly high concentration in Rotterdam. The euphoria surrounding the team's strong performances is no less intense on the Cape Verde Islands themselves.
Universiteit Antwerpen. Bepaal mee de toekomst.